The U.S. debt deficit for 2024 fiscal year was $1.83 trillion. The fiscal year for Treasury ends on September 30th of each year. So it is up from $1.7 trillion from previous year, which is 2023. And it's the largest deficit outside of the pandemic years, which is 2020 and 2021. The 2024 U.S. government debt exceeds GDP by 6.4%, larger than last year's 6.2%. Increased interest cost, social security outlays, and defense spending contributed to the large deficit. The interest payment for U.S. federal debt for 2024 is at $1.1 trillion, and it's increased by $254 billion since last year, which is an increase of 29%. The interest payment amounted to 3.93% of the total U.S. GDP for 2024. It's the highest percentage since the 4.01% observed in the 1998. Okay, and this chart is the interest on U.S. federal debt. So why is the interest payment surged by so much? It's because we had a higher interest rate. Okay, the Federal Reserve raised interest rate to combat inflation caused by the money flooding, or QE, due to the COVID-19. And when the Federal Reserve increased the interest rate, it leads to higher borrowing cost for everybody, including the government. The average interest rate on outstanding U.S. debt was 3.32% at the end of September 2024. It's a sharp increase compared to pre-pandemic level, where we had 1 point something percent. Okay, so the growing debt levels also contributed to the growing interest rate. The larger the amount of money the government borrows, or the larger debt principles, the more interest the government has to pay. So why is the government borrowing more debt if the deficit is already so high? It's because they need to spend more money than they are getting from the tax collection. So let's talk about the risks of that, right? There is a default risk, right? Because if the more money you borrow, the more risk you're able to default, because there's more liabilities to you. There's more liabilities for you to service the debt, to pay for the interest rate. But even though there's a slight increase in the default risk, but I don't think it's ever going to happen, because Federal Reserve have a money printer, and they will always just step in to prevent that sort of thing to happen.
Where does it come from? Do you just print it?
We print it digitally. So we as a central bank, we have the ability to create money digitally, and we do that by buying treasury bills or bonds or other government guaranteed securities, and that actually increases the money supply. We also print actual currency, and we distribute that through the Federal Reserve banks.
And there's another risk of increased interest rate for treasury bond, because the more bond the government sells to borrow more money, there's more selling pressure for the treasury bond on the market, and that's going to lower the price of the treasury bond, causing the rise in treasury yield. But I don't think, again, that's going to be a problem, because Federal Reserve, again, is going to print money by doing QE, right? Quantitative easing. That's going to manipulate the treasury yield. The more they buy, they're going to lower the price. They're going to increase the price of the treasury bond, as a result, lowering the treasury yield. There's also the inflationary risk, because the excessive debt can cause the inflationary pressure and reduce fiscal flexibility, right? Because during a high inflationary era, the government cannot just hand out cash to its people, because that's just going to drive up the inflation more, okay? And like I mentioned before, whenever the Federal Reserve turn on its money printing machine to do whatever, like control the long-term interest rate, or AKA the long-term treasury yield, whenever they do that, they're going to generate a lot of liquidity into the system. They're going to cause the lending facilities like the bank to be easier to lend out money, in turn create more money in the system, which is the money supply, right? When money supply increases, that's going to create inflationary pressures. Okay, and that's a real risk, I think, long term. So, as a takeaway of what's actually happening right now, right? I think it's no longer a free ride for the federal government because we're no longer in the low interest rate era or environment. The cost of serving the debt becomes so significant, much more significant and noticeable burden to the federal debt or federal budget. And for now, in terms of for the U.S. market, I think the investors are still showing little to no concern about the U.S. debt situation, so the market is still making all-time high. Thank you very much.